Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait a sec, more than a second actually. So, and we will start on time at 10:45. Hello, Claudius.
Hello. Who's speaking?
Hi, it's Giovanni Sansanelec. I will be your support for
Excellent. Hello,
for
Giovanni.
this session.
Grazie mille.
Prego. It's a pleasure. Now, just to clarify from a technical point of view, I will be managing the slides. So whenever I need to change slides, you and all the speakers are invited to tell me next slide. As I'm sure you use at the time. When we finish with the presentations, we can move to mural, and of course, that's also, I mean, that's also something that I can show. So just ask, and
So,
I just
Giovanni, can I just ask? So, if I go on mural with the link and I move the sticky notes or write sticky notes, it shows. But you
shows on the screen.
You are launching the mural on the screen.
Yeah. I'm launching. Yeah, if that's okay. I mean, if you prefer to launch it yourself, it's bad. It's okay. But
no, that's excellent if you do this.
Yeah.
I have it open already, and I can go.
Yeah, no, of course, it shows all the people that are there and whatever they do. So it's really automatic. Okay.
Yeah, I saw the other panelists also have already created their monikers or.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So now we have 2 minutes, so I think we can start on time, but we'll see.
Hello, everybody. This is Thorsten Prinz speaking. Just want to let you know that I'm online.
Hello, Thorsten. Welcome.
Hello, Thorsten. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Check from me too, Alpo Berri.
Good morning, Kun Covet.
Hello. So the panel is complete. And yeah, I mean, we have 1 minute according to my clock, so we could gently sort of start. Okay. Good. I think we can.
Whenever you want. Yes.
We can go ahead. So. Good morning, everybody. We had already yesterday a highly interesting day, and today also very interesting parallel sessions. I'm sure. Welcome to this parallel session on AI for medicine and healthcare, which is a very broad topic. I'm extremely happy to moderate this session and take you through the discussion with our very, very distinguished panel. We have very profound experts on this panel. Alpo, who is at the university in Finland, but has a major role also as a convener for SEN. There is Kuhn from Philips Healthcare, Thorsten Prinz from VDE Health, and my colleague Sandra Köcke from the JRC. My name is Claudius Griesinger, European Commission Joint Research Center. Just to mention that for once, if you don't know, it is the horizontal science and knowledge service of the Commission. Without further ado, I would like to invite then go through the panelists' slides and have the tour de table and also your points. We have something like 5 or 7 minutes. We're a bit flexible on that. So let's just go further, Giovanni. Yeah, of course, Slido. If you have questions, please use Slido, #standards4AI, and select the medicine and healthcare room. Okay, so thank you very much, Giovanni. Go ahead, please. Just a brief introduction from my side and a few slides. So my name is Claudius Griesinger. I'm working at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, as I said, the horizontal science service of the Commission. I'm actually a neuroscientist by training and worked on ocular dominance and orientation selectivity development, so pattern recognition in the visual cortex. That's my PhD on, and I did later do some scientific work on hippocampal plasticity, fast synaptic transmission in the cochlea. So I'm coming from an from an area also of plasticity and neural network learning, but really with the brain. So I'm not familiar with statistical models, but actually with the brain side. Been working quite a long time now at the JSC, and our focus is on innovation and health and life sciences, emerging technologies. We have a focus on artificial intelligence, data, and cybersecurity in health. I would just like to highlight, we recently did a systematic review on AI systems for COVID detection, which was highlighted in the European Journal of Radiology in 2021. This is quite upstream work. It was actually about looking really what is the evidence of this types of early development phase systems in the clinical literature. And what we found was interesting in the sense that there was a lot of heterogeneity. So my point is also maybe to say that there would be a great need for the clinical community to have better ontologies, terminologies, understanding, because there was a lot of heterogeneity in the way, and that actually hindered really a proper meta-analysis of that data that we collected in the systematic review. I think another aspect that's relevant here is we have a lot of science for policy experiences on novel health technologies. We worked on the Commission expert panels. We set them up and run them until handing them over to EMA. These are the high risk, the expert panels that look into high risk medical devices and IVDs under the new regulatory framework. We've developed a Commission expert guidance on innovativeness and health impact. We had a substantial role in developing a globally applicable adverse event terminology for the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum for medical device problem reporting, and then also for the EU reporting tools, including also a web browser that we donated to the IMDIF. We heard yesterday a lot about signal detection and incidents, and I think that's also a very important aspect, is the post-market follow-up. So we worked also on signal detections, on automated exploitation of real-world data with colleagues in the JSC, where we have very advanced software tools developed here on the campus. And last but not least, very important, because related to AI is, of course, the cybersecurity aspect, and colleagues have been working on the cybersecurity guidance for medical devices. Next, please. I want to keep it quite simple. So challenges, I would say health is a high risk area, of course, can be at least, and a high opportunity area. So we have to find the right balance to ensure trustworthiness while not stifling innovation. That's absolutely critical. And the AI Act is trying to do this, but I think it's important to keep that spirit on. So find the sweet spot basically between EU's very strong position in health technology innovation, and on the other hand, of course, making sure that people can trust innovations in that area, especially when it comes, of course, to medical equipment, which is then also regulated, and there are clear guidelines and references from the AI Act to the regulations. It's, I think, difficult what we can see also when we look at the landscape of the standardization, the different actors involved. It looks like it would benefit from a bit of coordination also, because there's a lot going on. Of course, groups talk to each other, but it looks like it's a bit of a jungle. So I think Alpo has a slide on the regulatory jungle. I maybe would like to make a point about the standardization jungle, which is for us not always easy to penetrate. So solutions, I think one issue I really would like to emphasize is to really consider the entire evidence pathway, all the communities along the innovation cycle, bridging also the communities that are involved, not just the technical people or the developers in that sense that do company level, but also there are a lot of clinicians that we need to listen to, the stakeholders, people that are affected by it, of course. And I think we heard similar remarks yesterday already in some of the presentations. So health applications for AI are very vast. So it's probably important to have a framework for assessing novel risks and opportunities of AI in medicine, health research also, and of course, healthcare. There are clearer rules when it comes to medical equipment, as I said, because of the AI Act and the Article 6. But if we look at the bigger picture, maybe it's important to look into stratification of requirements in relation to risks. And also a possible solution could be emphasizing more the importance of guidance documents first through multi-stakeholder processes as a first-line solution to enhance clarity and ensure global influence also of the EU. Next slide, please. So as way forward principles, horizontal standards on AI technology where there can be horizontal and maybe more sectorial guidance first that could grow later into standards. I think there are discussions also in various communities, and that we would very much agree with this. Keep it always innovation friendly. Consider trustworthiness versus burden. Of course, we need trustworthiness, but we also need to be careful not to overburden. And consider also the global use. I think this is tremendously important. We heard, I was now in the session on law enforcement and face recognition, etc. And I think it's also important to keep in mind the high income countries versus low and medium income countries. There are different scenarios and different challenges also in regard to data. So for the next steps, bridging communities, we believe would be very important. Also maybe coordinating by talking to each other, of course, and having really platforms for collaboration. So broader coordination to construct frameworks and a pragmatic roadmap and ensure EU participation in standardization efforts, of course, to the extent possible. Thank you. I think that's from my side. Can we move on? Yep, to Alpo. Please, Alpo, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Next slide, please. A little bit about my background. I'm a research director in Tampere University in Finland in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Technology. I've been a long-term member of various health informatics standardization groups and committees, but as a researcher, my focus has been in the pattern recognition applied to medical problems. Currently, we have two EU-funded projects, Envision and Covet, where we try to apply artificial intelligence to COVID-19 data. The next slide, please. There was one of the topics to discuss was the bias in these medical AI systems. And while I was looking for one of these articles to be as an example of those, I found many from this source, Health IT Analytics Journal. So this just shows that the problem is real and it needs to be addressed somehow. Next slide, please. When I put my researcher hat on and we have these AI development projects, sometimes we might feel that, okay, we are almost making such a good thing here that we could commercialize it so that the healthcare sector could make use of our research results. So typically, these kind of startups begin with two guys, one idea, and no capital at all. So the next slide, please. The guys would like to have freedom to choose their tools, their methods, the documentation ways, in order to make the best possible result with their resources in that company. But the next slide, please. They are faced with the regulatory jungle if they are operating in the area of medical devices. First of all, there is this medical device regulation, which you need to kind of understand, and it is supported by standards. My colleague in the university, who's also working in a small company, implemented the quality system standard ISO 13485 into their company, and he told that it required more than 100 documents to be produced. And as an engineer, who would dream of such a work to do? One would like to put the effort on the development of the real product to make it as good as possible. But this is the case. And I know that some companies who are operating with this area would like to stay on the wellness device side so that the medical device regulation doesn't apply, because then they wouldn't have to enter this jungle at all. And next slide, please. Don't just take my word for that. There was a recent study about the consequences of the General Data Protection Regulation. And there seems to be some evidence that a lot of mobile apps just disappeared because they couldn't cope with this regulation. Some of them deserved to disappear because they didn't respect privacy, but some of them would have been useful for their customers and would have brought revenue for their designers. Next slide, please. Then to the solutions. The research community has made these tripod and robust definitions for kind of reporting prognostic studies. And they are now extending these methods to the area of artificial intelligence. The results of that work are not yet available. It's underway, but we hope to get interesting results of that. If we look a little bit closer to the tripod approach, this is not the AI tripod, but the basic tripod. The next slide, please. It is this kind of a checklist that the development teams and the validation teams kind of can fill in to describe the method and the algorithms used in the development. So going through this list gives and filling in this gives a pretty good kind of description of what's being done. Next slide, please. One of the ways forward could be something like this. I heard this from a presentation by John Halamka, the president of Mayo Clinic platform, who is developing AI solutions for their customers of about 6 million. They have 6 million patients in the clinic, and they want to apply AI to that data to improve their care. And as a kind of a quality label or synopsis of a system, he displayed this example that it would contain a summary of what is the intended use of this AI system, what are the types of algorithms employed, and then the composition of training data used in the development. So then if this were a commercial product, the buyer could think of, is this kind of trustworthy enough for me to buy it, or should I discard it? And another learning from this is that although they have these 6 million patients, they have a little bit skewed training material in this application. It's emphasized by this proportion of non-Hispanic white patients in the database. So even with a lot of patients, they couldn't get rid of the bias in order to make enough data to use in this system. So I think we are going to face the issue of bias all the time. We just have to cope with it somehow. Our own experience is that we never have enough training data for our systems. We would always like to have more. Next slide, please. The next steps are, you have probably heard about the Commission standardization request to the European standardization organizations about making standards about artificial areas in 10 areas. I believe that's going to happen. And we in the committee Health Informatics NTC 251 are thinking about the need to produce vertical healthcare specific AI standards to supplement these horizontal standards to be produced by the Joint Technical Committee 21 Artificial Intelligence in Europe. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alpo, for these points and also for getting some examples from the literature. I think that makes it much more juicy and clear. And I think it's fascinating to see, especially the tripod and the probust AI, to see how they develop. Let's go on. I think the next is Sandra, Koen, please.
Good morning. So I would like to thank the organizers for having me. Let me briefly introduce myself. If you could move to the next slide, thank you. So I work for Philips. You may know the brand from TVs and lighting bulbs, but nowadays these products are manufactured by other companies. We sold off these products. We exclusively make medical devices. So we have about 80,000 people working on CT machines, MRIs, catheters, And about 60% of our R&D goes to data science and software development. Within my company, I have many hats, but one of the most important ones is that I translate the requirements for standards and legislation so that clinicians and product developers can understand how these requirements apply to them. And vice versa, I represent the company in various trade associations that you see here on the slide, at legislative bodies such as the Medical Device Coordinators Group, but also the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, on topics mostly related to software. And then there's a variety of standardization bodies that I try to keep on my radar and influence to the best of my abilities. If you could move to the next slide. So one of my preoccupations is, when I look at legislation and standards, is that whatever requirements are proposed, that they do add value to our sector, that they're also proportionate. And here I refer a bit to the jungle that Alpo is referring to as well. It's got to be doable, not just for the big companies, but also for the smaller companies. Another worry is often, I don't want requirements to be fixated into the system that would hinder future applications. And one of those applications I wanted to shed some light on is personalized healthcare. We're really at the advent of trying to make devices that do not simply provide the best average product to patients, because then compared to what you could do for a specific patient, you just reach an average performance. You could really improve those products to provide personalized health to these people. And this often involves machine learning medical devices. Machine learning medical devices is the topic that the International Medical Device Regulators Forum work on today, with a variety of work items that will be developed over the years to prepare for this new era. And to give a simple example of what this could mean, if you were to lose an arm, nowadays you would be fitted with a prosthetic arm that looks a bit like this one here on the picture, where there's some sort of hook there, and you're able to pick up a cup or open a door, but it's not allowing you to perform the fine motor movements to actually drink a cup of coffee without spilling. The only way where we could allow that arm to react according to what the patient wants to do is to train that arm further on the neural signals from that specific patient through a brain-computer interface, so that you can actually drink a coffee without spilling. This, I think, is a technology that we'll probably see within the next 5 years. Having said that, there are already applications on the market today under the MDR that have been trained on specific settings, healthcare settings. For example, for the prediction of sepsis and delirium, where traditional rules-based systems simply are not able to reach a performance that clinicians deem to add value, enough value to integrate them into the care pathway. So this is something that is at our doorstep, and where I feel that the standardization community and the legislative bodies do not sufficiently consider in their requirements. Next slide, please. Why is that? Well, one of the several of the challenges that we face is that we want, as manufacturers, obviously, to have access to data. Often, well, first of all, why do we need access to data? Of course, to assess bias, to assess also whether our devices perform sufficiently well, to make sure that we have statistical confidence that we meet state-of-the-art performance and robustness. But often, to check bias, the data has to be identifiable. It contains characteristics such as gender, such as age, for example, that would allow that data to be identified. So often the data that we need is identifiable data and can't be anonymized and de-identified completely. So it's subject to patient consent, to international data protection standards. And this has several implications. An issue that we face is that we often don't have access to sufficient data. So we rely often on academic institutes, hospitals that are data custodians for their patients, and that allows us to train our algorithms on their data without actually, as manufacturers, having the actual raw data in our hands. It's in the hands of these healthcare institutions. So that's a challenge that we have to deal with. One of the possible solutions that people have suggested is, let's download the models and use federated learning. This is what we do when we use these data custodians. But you can only do that to some extent, because if you think back of the previous slide, that prosthetic arm would need to be trained on the data of that specific patient. Obviously, as a manufacturer, I would not want particularly to have that data in my hands, and often the patient probably will not want that their data is sent to the manufacturer to tell them when they're actually drinking a cup of coffee. So in practice, how will this work? A doctor will prescribe the prosthetic arm to the patient, and the arm will be trained not under the supervision necessary of the manufacturer, but of the kinesiotherapist of the doctor. And so we as manufacturers will usually not know who are the actual patients that use our data. So we need some sort of metrics that allow us to nevertheless figure out, is there bias, how well are our systems performing, without knowing the identity of these patients. Next slide, please. So that's one of the, you can go back, yeah. That's one of the challenges and one of the things that I see in the proposed Data Act. It requires that we as manufacturers provide authorities on their request access to the data used in the training and the testing, which in concrete would mean that we would need to put in place contracts with the doctors, and the doctors would need to put in place contracts with their patients, so that if an authority asks for the data, that we can actually provide it, even though we may not have it ourselves. So this is an issue that we think we need to resolve. And one possible way is to interpret the requirements in the proposed Data Act as not us having to provide the raw data when we don't have it, but provide data metrics. And so we need to figure out what sort of data metrics can we provide to address this challenge. You can move to the next slide. To add another consideration, as manufacturers, we try to reduce bias as much as we can, but sometimes there are minority populations that we simply do not have access to within the Union. So we go to other parts of the world, like China, Latin America, and so forth, to figure out, do they have the data, and can we use that data to train our systems on? But these data lakes are remaining in these countries. They don't get shipped to the Netherlands or wherever where we can train our algorithms on that. No, we have to vault the data if we have it, and usually we don't. It's vaulted by the health institutions there. So it would create, of course, a perverse side effect if authorities were to ask that we send the Chinese patient-sensitive data over to Europe. Because what would happen if the Chinese were to add a similar requirement in their legislation? That simply doesn't work. So the solution is thinking about metrics that in some way can be recombined, so that we can, and you can move to the next slide, figure out for certain subsets of patients whether bias is present or not. So next slide, please. So in my view, one of the top priorities is to create good data management practices, some sort of checklist that tells our clinicians, that tells our software developers, okay, how do we deal with this? When do you need to vault? What sort of consents can you use? Standards that really have the essential principles of good data protection legislation embedded in them, meaning transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality, and I would also add accountability. Accountability across the different economic operators involved, because if we as manufacturers work with academic institutes for the training of our systems, of course, these academic institutes are accountable that the way they manage their data complies to these principles. So that sort of accountability across the economic operators, that has to be taken into account. Of course, a challenge that we often face is that when a team starts, they often ask, okay, how are we going to prove that we reduce bias? How are we going to prove that our systems are safe and performant? And what sort of thresholds do we need to have? I do not expect that standards are able to provide us a list of metrics, a list of thresholds, simply because there are way too many different types of diseases, 55,000 in the International Compendium of Diseases and Conditions. And each of these diseases and conditions often have different types of applications involved with them. So there's a multitude of these metrics that you can think of thresholds that you can think of, and these change year by year because the threshold, of course, increases all the time. So I don't expect that our standards will be able to provide us lists of metrics, lists of thresholds. What I think our standards can provide is methodologies to establish what are now good protocols to test this. Where can I find these metrics? How do I establish these metrics and these thresholds? And to some extent, we already have that. It's in our MDCG guidances, it's in IAMDRF guidances, but I still feel that notified bodies, but also software companies, they struggle with how do we do this? So I think with the guidance that we have today available, it may be a good moment to translate these into concrete standards, a sort of checklist. Did you do this? Did you do that? And so forth and so forth. Next slide, please. And with that, I wish to thank you and suggest we go to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Koen, also for the very plastic example with the bionic arm, and you elaborated a lot on, I would say again, on data description, basically, and I think we will go in the discussion methodology for data description. We go into this more deeply. Our next panelist is Sandra, if I'm right. Yes, Sandra, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I give a little bit an insight in my professional background. So as Claudius introduced, the area of medicine and health is quite big in AI. So my center of gravity has been a bit a combination of AI medicine, health and research, and healthcare. But I started basically with a more engineering education. So I have a STEM education, but I complemented that with a medicine and pharmacy degree. So that gives me already an horizontal view between aspects that are quite interesting also for these discussions on research and innovation. Now, another point that I think is quite interesting to mention about my education is that, and also about my professional experience, since I'm joined the European Commission Joint Research Center, I've been also working with quite a lot of industrial laboratories. So not only when I worked in my pharmaceutical company in the beginning of my career, and already today in the context of AI, you see that you have many stakeholders in the picture. We just mentioned also that there are research communities involved, but also industries, and big industries and small industries. And all of them have actually to have access and not be, let's say, disadvantaged because they're smaller ones. And we heard that also before. So working in the European Commission with networks of labs and many stakeholders shows that we really have to think about a co-design process with all stakeholders involved. With regard to AI and the area that I'm most involved in, which is health research, so I'm a toxicologist in the end, because I work now almost 30 years in toxicology. So in that area, we have had already several possibilities to go a little bit into the type of AI tools could help our work and automate our processes. since we're at the European Commission, we work with our regulatory bodies, like our receiving authorities, like EFSA, EMA, and ECHA. And already there, you see that some of these tools obviously can also help the regulatory process, but you also, by doing actually this technical work together in these multi-stakeholder groups and multidisciplinary teams, you start to see that you don't only need coordination, but really this collaboration, which we see also now already over these 2 days by lots of actors in this process. And that is something I think is quite important. Yesterday, we heard a presentation from the OECD, and we have been saying, okay, we need, let's say, standards at the European level, following up the AI Act, but we also need global standards. And Koen was just speaking about some good method practices, and in other research and innovation areas, we can take parallels. So I've been working also together with Sensenelec in a previous workshop on organ-on-a-chip technologies. So harmonizing things across the globe will definitely benefit what we have to do at the European level. Next slide. So challenges faced and solution, to complement a bit what the other panelists saying, because we all have a different center of gravity of interest, is first of all something that was mentioned over the 2 days, you know, this black box problem causing serious trust in what we do in AI, because people don't know that. And you note to see that also in other technological innovations. We have seen that also in the field of toxicology, we have there also some mathematical models. Well, this trust aspect and not understanding what is happening often causes, you know, a challenge and a barrier. So that's something where we can learn a lot from what has been done in other areas. The other thing is what also is a challenge, that often when you speak about artificial intelligence, you know, people tend to think that AI does it all. And it is not all solving problem, because there is some thinking process that say that all tasks, minute or gigantic, can be managed by AIs. Now, to increase efficiency and productivity, especially in this area where I've been working quite a lot in health research, you know, we have complex things. So we need exactly to know what parts of AI can be done and other parts what normally needs more supervision between, let's say, the technology and the human interface. So this AI human interface stays in a way a critical bottleneck, and we see that also with some concrete work we're doing on AI and new approach methods, for instance, in projects that we're running together with our food agency now. And let's say all these case studies are instrumental to understand where we see some of these challenges. But I definitely think that there are, like the others were mentioning, solutions. And we heard that one of the critical aspects in the whole development of AI is this context of trying to get a hook on the issues related to bias. And yesterday it was nicely explained that when there are big issues with the use of AI, it always boils down to bias. But one of the things I think we have to be very careful on is that AI is often seen as the big, you know, the biggest actor in this bias, but we all, human beings, we're biased. And since obviously everything is developed by humans, we need to see what kind of bias really we can have some hand on, and others which are more difficult to prioritize a little bit the areas we want to do. In toxicological processes, we have seen that AI gives enormous opportunities, but also it learns that we really need to work together with a multidisciplinary team of developers and people that experts in some fields to design and co-design often the good, let's say, tools we would need. And that is something obviously we can think about also later on in our discussions. So when I think about standards and knowing that bias is driven both by AI itself and the type of algorithms that are behind the tools, but also that bias is, especially in health and medicine, is driven by the humans, we need really standards to guide that AI-human interface process, with key focus on trying to reduce bias by acting on let's say, these two important actors, and we can elaborate on that further. So next slide, Claudius. So the way forward and the next steps is a focus on unlocking the full technological potential of health, is looking at it either that AI can be a driver or a stifler for innovation. And I think it was Alpo that just said it. We need everybody on board, you know, in this complex matter, big or small enterprises. So I see a way forward, and Claudius was mentioning the C of coordination. But I would like to add some C's of collaboration, co-design. And I think this workshop is already a great start to say that everybody has different stakes, but taking into account all these different viewpoints always will give a progress in research and innovation. And we have many examples of that. But this time we don't want to leave the small ones, you know, out of the playground. And I think we have seen that with some other technological advances. So these technological barriers, you know, can be overcome also with complex technologies. For instance, in medicine, we use a lot of cell and tissue models, but also mathematical models. So collaboration there of all stakeholders in this ecosystem is quite important. One of the things, especially when Claudius was mentioning, we will look at horizontal, let's say, standards and vertical standards. Now, especially within this area of health and medicine and AI, it's an extremely complex area. And often there is a lot of expert bias in the overall process from, let's say, the creation of the data. And it might be, we didn't mention it so much, but we have obviously quantum computing also as a transformational technology that has been now get into the visionary view of many. So are these additional aspects could help us more in these vertical standards, and the business help us to deal with these extremely complex health life science problems, and some papers, you know, came out on that. So just to wrap up, I strongly believe that there is not a good or bad actor in this business. It's I think artificial intelligence definitely offers enormous potential, but as I said, this human interface, they are created and trained using human-generated data, and they are also interpreted, and there are many passes in the process. So I've been working all my life on good method practices, standardization, and so on. So bad methods give bad data, and they can contain, as we heard, implicit racial, gender, and ideological basis, and you know, many other biases. So I think focus on building, and we heard it many times now over these 2 days, building inclusive AI health models will be necessary, and obviously with a focus of attention on avoiding bias and discrimination. And for me, this is, let's say, really the priority of the hour, and I'm looking forward to discuss further now with all of you on that. I see that you don't see me, Claudius. I don't know why.
I see you very well, Sandra. No,
okay.
I can see you. Thank you very much for bringing a broad perspective, and also emphasizing the human agency, I think, and also, of course, the aspects of human bias that is always there, which we indeed should not forget. Last but not least is Thorsten Prinz. Please, Thorsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and hello, everybody. Next slide, please. So by training, I'm a biologist and worked for many years as quality manager and in the biopharmaceutical industry, and also headed a research group. Nowadays, I'm working for the VDE, technology organization in Germany. And I'm consulting device manufacturers with AI-based software products regarding the regulatory requirements of the MDR regulation, and also give them support for having a look at the future legislations as the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. So at the moment, we are supporting in our projects the clients by implementation of quality management system processes for AI model development and evaluation, as well as the extension of the existing regulatory processes by AI-specific aspects, for example, in risk management or clinical evaluation. Next slide, please. So there are no sector-specific standards, as you know, for addressing the following challenges: absence of bias, balancedness, completeness, correctness, currentness, inter and intra consistency, representativeness, and train and test independence in the world of medical devices. There is also the question whether these standards, the importance of the standards is only related to the topics I just mentioned, but also the form, I think, is very important of these standards. So especially for the industry and the startups and the small companies, there should be examples included, maybe in form of a technical report, and including also best practices coming from, for example, research literature. There's much, as we heard already today, available, and also guidances that were developed by important market players by themselves, like, for example, Google and Amazon. Well, a current solution for us is at the moment to documenting the respective state-of-the-art measures in a data management document that is part of the AI model development process and the quality management system of the manufacturer. But of course, there has to be answered the question how this additional process I mentioned before, for example, this particular here for the AI development, are integrated in the software lifecycle processes of the state-of-the-art standard 62304. And related to this are questions like how shall the AI model be treated as a software unit, for example, and also to go in more detail, how should data statistics be included, for example, to what extent? How should raw data be archived? How often do have documents to be released on the data management, and also later on the development of the AI model? And what should be exactly included in the data management document? So we have a draft document for this that was created by our own. But the question is, for example, what would also be here best practice, like, for example, in data flow diagram or something like this. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned already, so these upcoming AI standards in the health sector, in the medical device sector, must fit into the landscape of already existing established standards. This would be, of course, the 60304, and also for standalone applications, the 82304-1 standard that must be considered. And the next point is, of course, that as mentioned already by my examples before, that these standards must really contain clear requirements and with examples, and not unnecessarily increasing the already very high requirements for the medical devices coming from the medical device regulation. So in fact, we heard this already today, that maybe a solution could be that first, because the standards need some time to be developed, first guidances could be released by some organizations, and these guidances are available already, some of them, for example, by the interest group of notified bodies for medical devices in Germany, or also a guideline by the Dutch Ministry of Health. And these could be further developed and later on be integrated in the standardization work. And then, as I said, examples for fulfilling the requirements could be included as well. That was my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thorsten, for raising these points that we will surely discuss in the panel discussion. Could I have the next slide, Giovanni? I would just like to very, very briefly, 2 minutes, introduce the session with a few thoughts, and we can pick up all the input that has already been presented by the panelists. Next one, please. So, I mean, it's AI applications in healthcare are high-risk applications. That's just from the commission flyer. So there are different sectors, and of course it concerns medical equipment. Next slide, please. You know that the AI Act provides a very clear risk classification. That's very simple in Article 6. This is sort of a simplification of the language there. It's basically if you have an AI system that is the product itself, and it's covered by EU harmonizing legislation that is outlined in Annex 2, and at the same time this product or the AI system itself needs to undergo conformity assessment under these legislations listed in Annex 2, then that is a high-risk application. If you look now at the health relevant regulations in this annex, it's of course the MDR mentioned by Thorsten and other speakers before, the IVDR, and I would say the personal protection equipment regulation. That's of course wider than health, and but it may be relevant also, and it is definitely very relevant in the health sector, as we all learned from the COVID crisis. And for instance, there are some examples where people develop cyber physical systems for monitoring and the correct use of this protective equipment. Next one. There are many diverse applications. I think that's also important maybe to keep in mind for healthcare. It's probably the sector with the highest number of AI applications. It's logical in a way, because in healthcare you have constantly to make decisions in workflows for pathways, select the right treatment, etc. So clinicians do that all the time. So it's a lot of using data information for making decisions all the time. But of course, you have the underpinning biomedical research also, where you create knowledge, and that's a very important aspect, the whole world of Cochrane, etc., and using data and information, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, and so on. So if we just look, and I don't want to go into details, just to say this is a categorization very broad that is in the WHO report. I think it's very useful. It's talking about healthcare, diagnosis, for instance, prediction-based diagnosis. This would be more the medical equipment stuff. So under the AI regulation, very clear, high risk. But also you have things like health systems management, administrative workflows, logistics, detecting whether there's waste, etc. You may have chatbots and virtual nursing assistants. I'm not so sure actually where they would belong. Some telemedicine applications. And we have heard from Alpo already an important remark that some manufacturers are actually trying to rather stay in the wellness area than going into going under the frameworks for medical equipment. I mean, that's also something to keep in mind. We have the public health and surveillance, which is a big topic, especially for COVID, of course, disease outbreaks, pandemic preparedness. AI can help a lot probably with that. And of course, the health research, really exploiting health data, electronic health records, drug development and repurposing. So there are good examples now where rheumatoid arthritis drugs are very successful in combating COVID because of for instance, the Janus kinase inhibiting properties. Next slide, please. So, yeah, thank you. If you stay there, of course, for all of this data are important. I think what I wanted to say with this is really, there's the AI Act. On the other hand, I mean, standards serve for a wide purpose, of course, not just for our regulation here, they're potentially globally applicable, and for very vast ecosystem of applications in health. It's very complex, as Sandra also emphasized. Next one, please. So since the workshop is about trustworthy AI in the end and non-discrimination, so on, just to keep an eye also on the 7 key requirements of trustworthy AI highlighted in the ethic guidelines by the high-level expert groups advising the Commission 2019. Here are the 7 ones, and we have heard, of course, a lot of it about non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, accountability. And I think one issue that we need to do, please, the animation, thank you, is to somehow bring together these high-level requirements with the specifics and the technological aspects that we've heard of, the metrology. How do I describe data, etc., to fit and satisfy these requirements and principles. Next one, please. So for the session, now it's business. We will first go into the challenges, topics, gaps, and needs. We will probably not go into the standardization activities. I think we don't have the time really for that. We'll map, if possible, the items over the development pathway, and then go into the prioritization. Development pathway really from data creation to the AI system production, development and production, of course, training, etc., up to the deployment and marketing. And the data, of course, permeate the entire development pathway. So to kick off the discussion a little bit, next slide, please. Oh, so sorry, that was meant before, it's fine. Exactly, to kick off the questions. So we want to go maybe, what are the key challenges that need to be addressed specific to medicine and healthcare? What are key aspects of standardization guidance? We've talked already about this role of guidance that would need to be tackled, of course, in view of the data quality. And also maybe we could touch on the diversity of application cases. Can they be appropriately served by horizontal standards in healthcare? A very complex field. And what's the role of specific guidance? So without further ado, I would maybe suggest we go directly in the mural and can also look at the mural. We have prepared a few sticky notes already, but we can collect that and maybe, or unless there are questions already now, there are 2 questions. Let's take those first. And so there's a question to Kuhn. If a bionic arm is trained on and by its new owner, why are data of other patients at all relevant? Why should they be part of the device delivery?
Yeah, for the arm specifically, that may not be necessary, but there are other applications where that could be useful. For example, if you have AI for prediction of sepsis, it could be beneficial to look at the data and the metrics from the different hospitals together, pull them together to see how this is evolving, and to see that certain hospitals may, for example, have drift compared to the average, and then further zoom into that. Depends really on the applications. There's no overall answer to this.
Thanks, Kuhn. And then there's a second question, which is a tricky one. In order to improve data quality, we need to take into account the epistemology of data. Very true. And be aware of the fact that authors document subjectively, elaborate. And I think there we are directly at the core of the matter. So Giovanni, if you could actually launch the mural, and I think we could go into this. I try to go on the mural and help maybe with the visualization. So let's maybe start, Torsten, you have provided some very detailed aspects. I mean, if we start with the non-universality of data, so what could be criteria for data description metrology and versus the purpose? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit, and I will populate the brainstorming corner here. You have in green here the different high-level requirements, and then we maybe want to go through data, AI system creation, and AI system marketing, the pathway. Thorsten, could you start maybe with explaining a bit some of the aspects you mentioned on data?
Yeah.
Description.
So first I mentioned the data statistics. So what should be done, in my view, is to characterize the data, and this is done by statistical approaches. And the question we always get is, to what extent do we have to perform data statistics? Because it is not true that in every startup there is an statistician that really is knowing all the different methods and can also select the right methods for the respective data set. This is one thing. And another thing is then also later on, when you have, for example, certain accuracy measures, also on the data, for example, that generally spoken for accuracy measures, you need also to consider aspects like disease prevalence, disease spectrum, the symmetry of the data sets, and so on. And symmetry of data sets is also a good example that, for example, is one of the things that really should be looked at in the, for example, in the data statistics. So this is some of the points I raised before.
Okay. I put also another little box here on methods to establish state-of-the-art measurement protocols and recombinable metrics and thresholds. I'm not sure whether you put that on already, or that's from
that was mine. Yeah, that was mine.
Cool. Maybe you can elaborate on that one, please.
Well, yeah. If you're supposed to provide access to the data that we use for training our systems, in some of these cases, as I illustrated with personalized healthcare, we will not have the data. It's in hospitals, it's with patients. So we will maybe have the metric from one hospital, from one patient. If authorities want to have a view on, is this system biased, is it drifting? We need to find a way to recombine these metrics to an overall metric to, for example, avoid that patients become identifiable to authorities or to manufacturers. And that's why there is this need to think of methods to establish that. And as I explained earlier, I don't expect standards to have the actual metrics. Just to explain how do you get to them. Of course, through literature studies, you need to determine the confidence rates, the levels that are needed. So the standards should describe the methods.
So that was I think raised by you and by Thorsten also, instead of having lists of metrics, thresholds, and details, rather focus on a methodology actually for the metrics in view of the purpose. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as manufacturers, we would love to have metrics. We would love to have such a list there because it gives legal certainty. You get that metric, you're done. But the practice shows that we've been able to do this in healthcare with the FDA back 10 years ago on lung nodule detection. China has now done it also for lung nodule detection and diabetic retinopathy and one-third disease. But we know from discussions with them, it stops there. It requires so much effort to just cover these diseases, let alone these 55,000 other ones. There's limitations to what you can do in standardization.
Then the other approach is the anonymization, so that when you have the data, you would let it be anonymized by a third party in such a way that there's no way that you can get back to the original data. And then it is possible to transfer that data also beyond the borders of countries.
But that's the issue. If you want to detect bias, there's going to be gender in there. There's going to be age in there. There's going to be lots of other factors that often make that you may anonymize it, but it's not de-identified. And that is what is crucial for the GDPR. So you need metrics.
Well, I think there should be some reasonability there. If you have the gender and age of a person, you really cannot trace it back to an individual. Particularly if it comes from another continent, and who would like to do that anyway?
So yeah, but then we need to change the GDPR.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can do that.
Or the interpretation to kind of have some sense in that.
Oh, can I? You're absolutely right. I mean, the GDPR has been discussed as not always easy and not always fully, how can I say, compatible with what people would like to do and how people in real world scenario work. I mean, I found it very interesting also what you said, Koen, on bringing the algorithms to the data instead of the other way around. Alpo, maybe if we just stay on the data quality or data assessment or descriptor lists, you mentioned the tripod AI and the probust AI for the bias. Could you talk a little bit more about that, actually?
Actually, I cannot talk very much about them because they are part of our kind of project documentation to use those methods, but we are in such a state of the project that we haven't got the data yet, so we don't need to apply those. But the literature is open access, so feel free to look for those in the internet. Okay, so invitation for everybody to look a little bit more on these potential tools. I mean, there is obviously a lot of work done in looking into these metrologies or methodologies. Sandra, maybe would you like to elaborate a bit more on your considerations, perhaps also on the human agency and the human interface and the biases there? What's needed, maybe? What is urgent from your point of view in that respect?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Claudius. I think, let's say, with human part, because we are now talking about, let's say, the data, also the data creation part is quite important. And as we have been seeing with any kind of methodologies to be, being on the basis of the data creation, I must say I liked a lot the idea to start analyzing the whole process before the data and the methodologies before the data. Because when you look at the whole picture, you have, let's say, the data are generated often by, let's say, experiments, people. You have then, let's say, the output, and you have the AI models. And the bias within the type of data generation, I think there is often the things, because it was just mentioned, you look in the public literature and the data are there. But these data, in the scientific literature, we have seen that with some examples already, they're all biased. Yeah, so you can have in the process several layers for the data creation process that you can separate, and where you can also get some type of standardization. Because let's say we heard already, you have cohort studies in medicine. We know very well, I just give an example, the field of autism has been dominated with a cohort that looked a lot to male autism, and later on you come into, let's say, issues that you see other aspects in, for instance, let's say the disease features. So the specification and the selecting of the study samples is a first important thing there. And then within, let's say, the whole pipeline of the experimenter and the creator of the data, you see there a lot of bias possibilities, because you can also have different types of exposure. So everything is human driven. You can bias in the measurement, the analyzing of the data. So the data creation is important, and therefore having methodologies at all these individual steps of the data creation that could, for me, be a way at least to get the most critical part on the human variability out by understanding what are the different tasks within that process that could be more transparently described. So a guidance, a methodological guidance, and we've seen that in other areas, has been really quite a breakthrough. That we have seen that in the field of cell and tissue work, all these new technologies, so good method practices, so good AI method practices, and look at the whole process, you know, from the beginning to the end, and all the actors and all the steps. I think that part is quite important. Obviously, I speak a lot with focus on health research data, but a lot of these data are extremely biased, and we know that from our own research experiences. We use what we have.
Thank you. So, I mean, fair maybe also to say again, important as always, the data have to be seen in relation, of course, to the purpose. You mentioned the example of autism, etc. So I put that just all here. We had also our visiting lobster, that's Torsten, who came up with 2 more points here. Data required size of data sets. That's very important, of course. So
I would challenge that. I don't think that's realistic to have a sort of minimum number of data sets that you need to prove a certain performance. To make it very concrete, imagine that you have an AI system detect lung cancer, and it's the threshold to be clinically meaningful and to reach state of the art is 90%, because radiologists achieve 90% detection ratio. It's a fictive number, but it's approximate. Imagine that your application has 98% accuracy and precision in detecting these lung nodules. You may reach statistical significance, 80%, 95%, depending on what literature tells you to have as confidence, with just 20 or 50 data sets. If you have 91%, you need a lot more data sets to prove with 95% confidence that you reach state of the art. So you cannot express it in terms of numbers of data set. You can only express it in what's the threshold, what's the confidence levels that I need, and where am I with my algorithm performance? And only by doing a small test with your prototype will you know that approximately, and can you make some guesswork on the number of data sets that you will need. But you will not have the minimum number. We would love to have it, but it doesn't work that way. Statistics is the way around.
That may be true, but you should justify why you have selected this size of data sets, because there are also many research models published where the response on this publication was that the data set was, for example, not large enough, to have really a good model. So that's what I meant. So I didn't mean really fixed numbers. I meant more in the direction that you justify why you have selected for your application this size of data set.
So I mean, to maybe wrap that up, again, we are talking maybe more about methodology, Torsten, what you meant, justification, transparency, not so much the detailed metrics and thresholds directly. So can you live with that, Koen, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's of course my suggestion as well. Focus on the methods to establish how do you reach these, how do you make those justifications.
So if we see that, I think we probably everybody would agree that justification and transparency, also this is of course a principle, transparency, which touches on intelligibility and explainability, of course. So we have here data visualization. Maybe Torsten, you could explain a bit what you meant with this.
Yeah, for certification purposes, you have, as a medical device company, at a certain time, of course, auditors in your house, and they look at the different documents. And I think what's state of the art to have, for example, such a data flow diagram, so that immediately the auditor, for example, could see what data set was originally selected during the pre-processing, for example, what data have been removed and what are the contributions of the different classes, for example, to the whole data set and things like that. And I think this is one of the examples of, let's say, good practice that should be included as well. And a standard could address these data visualizations just by giving examples, for example.
So we've now worked a bit on the data creation more. Probably we didn't talk about data silos, but I would see a connection between having a sound methodology for describing data in view of a purpose, which also could be used for data silos, for instance, for SMEs, as a data silos are offered for SMEs, of course, for you, so that there's also transparency ensured basically throughout the whole pathway. I think we have to soon come and wrap up. So let's maybe move. I mean, there are more things on the AI system production and marketing aspects. I just pull them over here, but let's not go into the details here, but rather go now to this categorization and maybe focus really on what is, in your opinion, let's just do a tour de table. So where are we here? What's needed from the stuff that we mentioned? I start with Kuhn. Could you, what's, in your opinion, from data creation, AI system creation, development, what's the main?
Yeah, what I had focused a lot on this, on the method to establish the rationale, as Torsten refers to, the method to establish these sorry, I'm moving the wrong thing. These data sets, I would put this all over the place. So it's a bit about measuring. How do you measure? And how do you characterize the performance? And what sort of metrics can exist? And maybe we have to work with examples. And so I would, I don't know how this works, but I would duplicate this box also on AI system creation and production and on data creation. So it's all over the vertical column here.
Okay, I think that's the box. I think that's a key message. I think that already crystallized from this panel discussion. Alpo, what is your view?
Well, I think it would be useful for the potential customers of these systems to have a document which says what are the minimum characteristics of the AI systems that you have to describe as a kind of a product documentation before purchase. So that, as I showed in my example, what are the methods that the system applies, what is its intended purpose, and what kind of data has been used in its training, for example, and also its performance characteristics. How many % of the cases that, let's say, lung cancer, it identifies out of all patients that there are. So this kind of quality label standards could be useful for the customers at least.
I put that here on the top as a quality label, maybe in the domain more here of along the pathway for deployment and marketing, applicability limitations, but also basically transparency, how the system was trained, and basically explaining to the developers how to do and compile such a documentation.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Okay.
You'd want the same on data, I guess, Alpo?
Yes, the description of the data is part of that, yes.
Yeah. I read the Parliament research report on AI in healthcare, and they call it a data passport. And they have a good example there on how that may look.
I mean, that would, in a way, of course, start down here with the data creation, go through for the model creation, basically. But from what I understood, the main point was here to have something which is relevant then for the deployment, but it gives the guidance to the developers how to compile such a document, which links to transparency, doesn't it, Alpo?
Yes, that's part of it, yes.
Okay.
I like this idea of the data passport, you know, and since we now in this team, you know, we really focus a lot of the methodology. So I think, you know, starting from there and getting also the underlying process steps, you know, on let's say the data, the methodologies by used, but also some type of confounding areas, because you know the data, obviously you have some constraints in the data generation. So when you would have a data passport where you would also say that some of these confounding factors are just, let's say, the cohorts and let's say the cohorts behind the data and the financial aspect. So I just wanted to ask, when you speak about data passport, Koen, and your methodology to come to this data, there are so many factors that are affecting in the scientific literature also what you see out there. So how could that be then be in a very simple standard way be described in such a data passport, because it's the historical background on the data, and this you often miss because we don't know the methodological background, and so we need some standards for all the parts towards that data creation, but it should be, then also be on the passport. So I don't know the details about, let's say, the guide. It will be high level guidance, but that's quite important.
It is indeed high level. It's the example I saw was in the European Parliament Research Service report AI in Healthcare study that was just this month released. So I would advise that you consult.
Very interesting, very interesting, yeah.
So to complete that, Torsten, do you have a view where you see things that are most in need across the pathway and in terms of the different domains?
I just was busy with adding another card. So just added a card that is related to the AI system, and these are safety and security risks, AI specific ones.
Yeah.
So I would say that, for example, we know that for medical devices, the 14971 is the respective standard, but what should be or could be helped is to have also an additional standard or whatever extension that mentions, for example, the specific AI risks, and because then these can be more easily integrated, for example, in the risk analysis and then also finally in the risk management report.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's something that maybe also links to, if we look at the metrics here, to the point before on the guidance for documentation of the AI system, that also these aspects are touched on. Safety and security would be very close to my heart also because of the cybersecurity aspects with the adversarial data or data poisoning, by the way, that can also help you a lot with understanding blind spots, of course, in your data set that are quite interesting. Is it fair to put that here, more or less, Torsten? I leave it sort of in the wobbling here in the middle.
Yeah, fits. Yeah.
Then I would like to close. We're a little bit over time, but I think if you're happy with that, we could just close by going to the prioritization chart. And I would like to invite each of you again, maybe to say one point where you really think that's the top priority. Maybe it's difficult, maybe it's easy, but what's sort of the most important stuff to be done? Let's start with Alpo.
I think it is important that the standardization request-based standards are created and then examined in the health sector whether these are sufficient enough for that, also for the health sector, and if there are kind of obvious gaps, those would be filled with standards that are needed by the industry auditors and the general population to trust in these AI systems.
Okay, so horizontal standards being developed and then checking these horizontal standards whether they are actually fit for purpose also for health applications.
Yep.
Okay, I put that. Is that difficult? It's not so easy because the standards will take a while. Is that okay? Difficult but important, or is that for you in between? You choose.
Well, that's regular work for the standardization bodies, I would say.
Okay, so let's put it just in between. Koen.
Yeah, and the easy and important, I would say start with terminology. I mean, it all starts with terminology, and we're pretty far advanced with that. I would also add there, in the same quadrant, easy and important, the data passport and the model cards. We also have several examples of that. We may need to make it a bit more concrete for healthcare, but I think it's relatively easy. In the harder part, but difficult and important, is the recombinable metrics, the methods to establish these recombinable metrics and to find thresholds.
In view of passport, you mean?
Among others, because it's metrics about the data, but it's also metrics about, is there bias in the model? And it's also metrics about the overall performance of the model. So it's not only about bias in data of the model.
So, but you also mean, of course, the algorithmic bias that could be there. And
yeah, it's one of the metrics, yeah.
End user bias actually in the deployment. I mean, monitoring market, very important.
Yeah.
Okay. Thorsten.
Yes. So maybe a little bit more on the working level, I suggest to have standards developed for the statistical characterization of data sets.
So when you say statistical characterization, this is basically not just descriptors, but a more profound data analytics, basically, of the data in view of the purpose, balancedness, representativeness, these aspects. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Because how will you judge that a certain data set does really fit for the purpose if you do not know what are the characteristics and you have let's say no hard criteria, for the evaluation.
This is for you important, of course. Is it difficult? Is it easy, or in between?
I think there are experienced people, so I would say in between.
In between, okay. So let's put these two sort of here. Oh, I can even turn things. Wow. Sandra, it's your view.
Okay. I would think about maybe, although I see terminology easy and important, and I would definitely agree with that, but I would go, when we say the word terminology, I would like to see when you go from the data creation to the different steps, so from the product generation and actually the marketing, that you have a way where terminology is harmonized from the data creation through the whole process with all stakeholders involved, because we have seen that in other technological fields, if you work together on a whole process evaluation, this will help by actually harmonizing terminology, indeed, help the area further. Now, to do that over the 3 areas of focal attention, it will be a complex process. So terminology in it per se is easy, but trying to write something down in a guidance on terminology and linking it to all the process steps and the individual tasks will be more a complex endeavor. The other aspects which I like to touch upon, because Koen was mentioning on personalized, products, but I'm thinking about also a lot of the personalized health So one of the difficult areas, most difficult areas, and especially linked to this as a vertical, difficult, very complex problem, is also how you can get really much more of this personalized information into the playground, because the whole health business is really dominated, as we heard, by some main players, and also the data that are produced or that. So that is more the bias in the data generation. And that is, for me, this personalized aspect is difficult, but very important in the different aspects of the area.
How would you like to have that?
I would say personalized, because we talk here about personalized medicine, personalized AI, and it's a big word. But in practice, we have seen it with the presentation of Alpo about this guy, this person, I wrote it down, Alamka, that when you look at the data sets, you know, you try to be, let's say, getting, let's say, healthcare for everybody, but in principle, we know that some, let's say, groups are completely left out. So I would say it's about personalized medicine and healthcare and research, but the difficult thing is that up to now, the data that we have are really, really extremely biased. So I would put it as personalized aspects throughout the whole life cycle, because in each of the steps we have different links to that, of the whole overall process cycle.
So, but would come back a bit to the example that Koen showed us with the bionic arm.
This is one in the products, but you also have that with the data. So I gave the autism case, but you know, for instance, we have cases also with many populations in the world. So it comes more to this fairness and, let's say, making health for the global population and not for some population that always part of the cohorts when we look at health research. So personalized in a big in a broad sense of the word. So health, one health for all people, wherever they are on the planet, but also let's say thinking about the difficulties there to get hold on these cohorts.
So that's the non-discrimination. I mean, there are two things here, I think.
Yeah, non-discrimination. I like that.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's high-level principle, but what your message is, that also needs to be taken up. And I think this is something we would need to link, and maybe in the rapporteur session, then we will link it to the description of standards, the methodology, as description, sorry, of the data sets and methodology. I would like to close now, and I'll just put one more little sticky note there, and I'm very much probably repeating what has been said before, but I would even go a little bit lower. I would say criteria, first of all, for data descriptors in view of purpose. Yeah. So actually that this link is made clear, that could be a guidance document, very much what are the descriptors that you need from a catalog of descriptors and how do you measure them? And from that, once you have a good description actually of your data set, I think you're in a much better position to judge, of course, the quality of the data in view of the purpose of the use case, and also, of course, all the aspects of fairness and non-discrimination. Transparency is probably, in a way, encapsulated in that, because if you have a good data description, of course, at least it's intelligible what you've done. I think we have more than exhausted the time. We ran already 8 away, 15 minutes from the lunch break. So that was a super exciting session. Thank you so much, panelists. I'm mea culpa that probably I didn't check enough the questions, but there were not that many. I think there was one more, and maybe we should just take that before we run off to get a bite. There is a question here: what is the role of ISO EN 13606 EHR standard in documentation of health data? Maybe Alpo, you are the best to answer that, or Koen, I don't know. Thorsten, of course, I couldn't answer it, I have to say.
Well, it may have a role for those who apply that standard, but in many cases, the electronic health records are based on different standards than this one. So that that standard has only, I would say, a marginal role in this respect.
Okay, I think with this appraisal of this question, we more than deserve our lunch break, and we see each other then for the plenary again at 13:30. So I wish you a good break, enjoy your lunch, and talk to you later. Thank you so much again. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudius, for getting us through this. Thanks. Amazing.
Thank you.